Hi, Susan.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good.
Did you have any agenda today?
No, Eric, I talked to Eric and he said that the other new team had a few talking points they wanted to go over. So maybe we'll just be listening today about that. So
Yeah, sounds good. We'll see if they are ready. I did ask Eric, like what are the topics and work items that they're interested in.
mhm.
So Eric proposed that they can do like a document about their proposal and what they want to change, and then bring it up. So I'm not sure if they will be ready today. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah. We have a demo of Ratify coming up in KubeCon. So we've been working with Steve, who's going to be demoing Ratify there. So there's been some discussions about that as well, on how we can improve the user experience. I think you might have seen those.
Yeah, thank you for tagging me on that thread. I did see I think the suggestion one's suggestion is very valid. Like we should not name it like Ratify test cert.
Yeah.
I think the test cert in the variable name, I think from our perspective, we mean that this is a demo for demonstration purpose.
Yep.
But it could be confusing. It's like, is this how
you're supposed to use it?
Yeah. And I think you do have a valid point. Like this should be, if he's doing a real demo, or maybe he should do the real like mounting of the certificate, etc. Instead of passing just the public key as a string.
Yeah. I guess in the interest of time, he was interested in just what is the shortest number of commands he can do to actually get it all running.
Yeah. Is there a way to quickly mount a cert from disk?
There is a way if we can update the chart a bit. So Eric and I were talking how right now, like the way we generate the cert file is like we actually create a Kubernetes secret. So if you like override the ratified test cert with your own cert value, it'll actually create a Kubernetes secret, and then in the secret itself, it'll define a new file called like ratified test cert. So if we could take like the easiest way would be you can take an array of certs instead of just a single cert in the values YAML, and then it would create multiple files, and then it would mount all of those files under the same directory.
And for the demo purpose for KubeCon, would the demo step be Steve create a secret as a part of his demo?
No. So it would be in the Helm install command. He would, instead of overriding
the values,
just the ratified test cert, he could do like a override and provide an array of certs.
But wouldn't that still be an array of public key? Like, is that a realistic?
It's not a great way of doing it. Yeah, it's still not the best way, but like if you want a quick and fast way of doing with multiple certs, that's one way of doing it. Yeah, Eric also has more context on it, so I see he's joining, so he can also talk about that. So,
yeah, maybe we can talk about it. Hey, Eric. Hi. Akash and I were just saying that Steve is doing a demo at KubeCon that involves a Ratify scenario, and what is the best way for demo purpose, like two goals. We don't want the demo to be really long, but we also want the demo to be a realistic user scenario. Would it be to provide an array of certificate where the certificate is string of the public key, or would the demo be creating the actual file on disk somehow and mount it?
Probably I would lean towards file on disk. So the chart does that today, but we only do it with one. And I don't know how hard it is to support more than one. But if we provide it, oh, so you're saying put the public key directly into the config. Is that what you're saying?
And no, we're just exploring what would be a realistic demo.
Oh, I would probably say file on disk would be the most realistic demo, because having people like put the string of the cert into the config in that array would not work very well.
Yeah, what are the chart changes we would need for Steve to demonstrate a file on disk instead of a string?
I think you could add a volume mount, right? Just to the chart.
Yeah, it'd be kind of clunky, but you could have cert 1, cert 2, cert 3, like, yeah, you can make it happen, and without having to figure out like the semantics of Helm like ranging over a list. I mean, I know for the other thing that I was thinking about is I know for like most other things, the certificate is a bundle where more than one certificate, like PEM, exists in the same file. So it would be interesting to know if that is possible with the Notary like cert pool. Like if we could support passing one file that has many certificates in it, then that might make it easier for us, because we could just cat all of the certs into one file in the chart, and then we would only have one file. Oh, Sajid, you got.
Go ahead, Zach, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Thank you. Okay, just starting with coffee. I can give some information about what's happening on the Notary side, because we discussed local key store and local signing keys for Notary yesterday with Millen and folks from AWS. For what Notary is going to do is they're going to have a directory structure with specific locations of how key needs to be placed. And they're going to say that for this given image, this is the key you need to use, so that there's going to be a binding between key versus and the location of the key with what image and things like that. That specification has just made it in. They're going to implement the policy inside Notary to support that hierarchy. I think from Ratify, just specifying a root directory of where these certs lie would be the easiest thing to start with. And in the current form, because we don't understand policy binding with image, maybe we can just pick one cert, and we already have a way in kind of like looping through the certificates in that directory. So we'll have to have a work item to consume Notary's trust policy definition, which is a JSON file that kind of like says for each image where in that root config should the certificate be mounted to. It's basically using the whole XDG config directory. So you would have dot something, some bare root pivot against which all the certificates need to be mounted from a specific node and things like that. So I would say once that implementation is done on their side, maybe we can take that. But for now, single directory, dump all the certs in there and just iterate over through a mount point might be the easiest thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So for trust policy, that they're starting implementation of that. That's going to be in the library, right? It's not going to be in the CLI.
It's in the library. So
Okay.
I'll share the specification that just got merged. It shows you how the directory structure for the certs also need to be there. So a lot of the ambiguity will just go away. The other thing is they're looking at password protected keys for local signing. But definitely that means there'll be the public key will still be just on disk, but we'll follow the same structure. Because let's say you have an image from public ECR, public like MCR and Docker Hub and some other private registry. All these images will need to use maybe different keys routed to different CAs, right? So defining that that's what the trust policy definition enables you to do. So we should be able to just use that as a way to kind of like look for keys. But it's just only the spec is done. No actual code has been written. So we'll see how it comes to fruition, and reality is different from specifications.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how we end up leveraging that, because we're so I guess so Ratify, there's policy that you can do at Ratify level, and now there's going to be policy you can do at the verifier level in Notary, and then there's policy you can do at the gatekeeper level in Cluster. So we'll have to see how we put things at each level. Okay.
I have 5 minutes. I can share my screen and just kind of talk through that if it'll help this group as well.
Yep, go ahead. I'll make you the co-host.
Oh, okay.
Make. Yes. Okay.
All right. Can folks see? I don't know what exactly is being presented. Okay.
Yeah, we can see.
Right. So this is the Trustor that's being defined here. And the whole idea is that you will have a notation Trustor, and this would follow the directory structure. For example, each PEM would be within their respective roots. And this trust policy will define, for example, for this is kind of star means all images, but there is probably a targeted sample also that we can look at. All right, so let's look at this one instead. So the registry scope says for this registry within this repository, you can actually skip verification, which means don't do the verification. And in another case, you would have to maybe use a specific identifier that's of this format, which is this subject, CA, and things like that. So these two things will come in together. So you will have the hierarchical set of keys like this that will enable you to store this. And you would also have the policy file that will enable you to reference for each image what policy needs to be used and things like that. So once this is kind of implemented inside Notation Go, which is a library that will have the full implementation of how do you look up a policy, how do you find the certificates, it should be pinned on this specific location. So from Ratify's perspective, what I'm thinking is that we can maybe define a mount point where all the notation search needs to go, and then load this trust policy up in JSON somehow, and just pass the verification through. That's roughly the discussion that we had. Again, this is all designed, so as we find issues, we'll probably have to evolve it going forward.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Sajay. It makes sense to me. Any other comments, anyone? Okay, we can move on to the next item then. Let me see if I can share my screen. Reclaim host. Can share files, screen. Can everyone see my screen, or am I frozen? I feel like I'm frozen.
Yeah, I cannot yet. It says that you've started to share your screen.
Okay, it feels like everyone is no one is moving. I feel like my internet is having some issues.
And I see Lee up there.
Yeah, I think Susan's internet probably isn't working because there's movement.
Uh-oh.
Okay, with my limited bandwidth, let me stop sharing and maybe make Eric the host.
Sure. Did you want to share the agenda?
Yes, I just had one item on the board today because I just started a PR for the basic end-to-end scenario. I just added a test script where I've put in our quick start scenario in there as a basic validation for some basic coverage. So Eric, I just made you the host. Would you be able to share screen?
Sure. Let's see. Here, we'll share this and we'll see. Is this?
Yep. Yes, that is the right file. So I've added some additional steps to the workflow on PR submission. And the couple of big chunks is the bootstrap step would install all the dependencies like the kind cluster bats where we need to run the test script, and Helm, like all the dependencies that we need to run the test. And then the next step is run end-to-end, which will deploy Gatekeeper, build Ratify locally, and deploy Ratify into the pod. And the make test end-to-end scenario would just run whatever's in the test.bats file. So if you go to the make file, these are the newly added targets for each step.
Okay. Let's see.
I referenced the Gatekeeper end-to-end scenario. So most of the dependency are the same.
Okay, so this follows the model that Gatekeeper uses for end-to-end?
Yes.
Okay.
And the idea is we're just adding the basic scenario right now, and over time we can add more scenarios. And I know we talked about setting up a local cluster instead of depending on an external registry.
Mm-hmm.
I will work on that separately. At the moment, it's just calling out get started registry.
Gotcha. So test end-to-end test. Okay. Let's see. Certs and then.
These are, steps copied from our quick start.
I see. Okay, cool. Awesome.
Yeah, so this PR would just get us started. So feel free to comment. This would allow us to have some basic coverage on PR submission.
Cool. And this bats, what is bats? Bats is just a runner.
I found I was going to ask the same question, and then I kind of looked up Open Policy Agent has a very similar test bats infrastructure. So I'm guessing there's some cross-pollination of ideas there.
Yes, so Sertag created the issue. I should have mentioned in the pull request, this addresses the issue he filed on our repository that we don't have any end-to-end scenario, and he linked us to their test file. So I just referenced their test infrastructure.
Right. So bats is an executable. It's the I see. It's the download stuff. Bats. Okay. It's bats core. Okay. I'll have to go Google that. I haven't seen that before. Cool. Yeah. This is so let's see. So the scenarios that we run here are run in cluster with this. Okay. Cool. All right. I will. I'll go put my comments at some point. Here, I can give this back.
Yeah, I don't think we have anything else on the agenda, so the floor is open for any discussion. And I did hear from Eric that Lee, you reached out to Eric, and there was some discussion about different ideas. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I was sort of expecting my other team members to be here, but I think they're in a meeting that's running long. Well, that and one of them's on the East Coast. But we've been looking, things aren't quite pulled together at this point. We are trying to write up sort of a design proposal for how Ratify could better align like in a Kubernetes context, as well as some other things that we think are just general improvements to Ratify. I guess I can go ahead and share that and just walk through what we have so far. I didn't fully plan for this because I was expecting the project lead to be at this call, but
We can cover, if you want, you can cover it on our next one.
Next week, our entire org has like an internal hack week. So next week will be totally out of commission. So we'd have to delay to talking about it for 2 weeks from now. And I think we do want to be able to contribute and get moving on anything that we can. So I'm gonna go over some of it if I'm able to share my screen.
Oh, I think we have to, I think it's
Yeah,
set
I
up that
believe-
we have to hand it. All right, I think I'm make host, done.
Okay, so now I should be able to just share the whole screen. So I will, let me make this a little bit bigger. There we go. So these are our use cases. So I don't know what your specific use cases are, but most of ours are very Kubernetes specific. The requirements we can pull out from our use cases is that Ratify should run an AKS. It can verify SBOMs, it can verify signatures, and can handle nested artifact references, can verify signatures. And this one's a bit more of a long shot because there's nothing in this area at the moment, but it's on our list and can verify absence of vulnerabilities. So that would do something like consuming a vulnerability scan and reporting on the results. Looking at maybe how Ratify would best function in a Kubernetes environment, our default go-to is that the config.json would be better leveraged as CRDs. And we've mocked up some sort of generic ideas for the refer, store, and verifier CRDs that would allow people to basically customize and say, I would like a store that is of type Auras, and like here's the auth mode. Or more complex, they'd say, I want a custom store. They'd say like type is custom, and then they'd put an address that Ratify could reach that store at. In order to better support this sort of function, there's a few key concepts that would have to be better enabled in Ratify that we are starting to put together plans for how this could work on. One of them is dynamic configuration updates are pretty much a must. If Ratify is going to run as some sort of server component rather than as a local like execute one CLI operation and then stop, being able to keep a cached configuration and dynamically change that when config.json or the CRDs change is pretty important. The other thing that would really support Ratify in Kubernetes is service-to-service communication. So right now there's a like plugins model, which works solidly in a local environment, but in a Kubernetes environment, it starts to look really ugly because you're either misusing a volume mount to put your plugin into the container with Ratify, or you're adding another layer on top of Ratify's image. And both of those are a little bit ugly. So if there's a way for HTTPS or even gRPC communication between the executor and the refer store or verifiers, that would definitely open up Ratify to be more able to run in different environments. And then Kubernetes specifically, we're thinking about the CRDs as namespaced, and that sort of opens up a multi-config or multi-tenant capability where if you're using namespacing to delineate what rules are applied in which namespace, you can then have multiple teams with different referrer stores or different sets of keys that they're validating against. And that seems like a pretty big concept for Ratify to support at this point, because right now it seems very scoped in on one operator, one user, and that's all you get. These are the specific like verifiers that we've identified that we want to have. This is definitely work that we're less focused on until after Ratify runs cleaner in Kubernetes. And then these were some other sort of nice to haves that we've identified so far that they're not super prioritized for us, but we think they'd be a really strong win for you all or for Ratify. This one came out of last week's conversation. It sounds like y'all are still considering it, which is have Ratify evaluate things against the OPA framework when it's not running in a context where it's being called by Gatekeeper. And that lets, if you keep all of the policy out of Ratify, then OPA, the policy engine, can do what it does best, and Ratify, the go look up information about this image engine, can do what it does best. Another nice to have here is split into multiple repositories, which is just have a central repository for like the core framework. Sorry, that pop-up keeps covering the text. A repository for a CLI specific wrapper, a repository for a gatekeeper or a server wrapper. And then it looks like right now Cosign is sort of tangled into Oras as its own, as like a combined store plugin. And that might want to change in the future because it sounds like there's pretty heavy adoption of Sigstore. So having that as a first class store as opposed to sort of a side note from Oras would probably be a little more powerful. I wish I had a second screen because I can't see anyone's faces or responses. I realize this was a huge amount to go through, and I want to emphasize that this is all just sort of experimental, where we've been sort of poking at the design, trying to figure out how it would run most cleanly in a Kubernetes space. And we haven't fully prioritized this yet. We want to hear from you all what your thoughts on all of this are and where you might prioritize. And if any of it sounds like totally no way or super positive, let's definitely do that. Either way, we definitely want feedback from you. I can either stop sharing my screen or I can move around and show specific spots if people have questions.
Yeah, I mean, I can go. I liked it. I think those are good things. I liked all of those things. The only one that is, the one that I like, but that will be a challenge is the service to service. So I have looked at in the past, when I looked at this, I looked into some libraries that we could use gRPC as the interface between the plugins so that Ratify could create them and then communicate over gRPC, at least locally. And then if we did that, you can follow the same model, but for other services that might be running in cluster. But the only caveat there is the strict time constraint within the request. And so we potentially open ourselves up where if like some of these pods that you would reach out to are running on other nodes from the Ratify pod, then you start running into latency issues between those. So that would be, I mean, as a model, I think it's good. We would just have to characterize what kind of extra performance hit we might take from that.
Definitely, that's been on our minds as we've been thinking about this because it's hard to be sure what sort of latency we'd see from different things. One of our assumptions going into this has been that in the cluster, in the cluster, wow, I'm sorry, it's late for me. In the cluster, we're sort of assuming latency is fairly low, which may not be a safe assumption, but we were assuming a lot of the costs time-wise probably came from reaching out to the refer store, anything with like further authentication flows, things like that that go outside of the cluster, outside of the local host. Though even within the cluster, it will add time. It's something we're thinking about with different parts of this, like the namespacing was also intended as a potential time save, because then rather than running every possible verifier, you're running a stricter set that's very specifically just the ones that have been set up for this particular namespace. So that, you know, in a multi-tenant scenario, you're not still running across every store and every namespace or every verifier.
I think I wanted to echo what Eric is saying. I think we want to do all. It's just a matter of what the priorities are and making sure we can address each one at a time. I have another question fundamentally, which is, are the building blocks something that you can stand behind? Like you know that we want to do artifacts, we want to verify them, and you might have a signature on an Sbomb and you want to find those scenarios. So conceptually, those building blocks, do they seem like we need to revisit that? If not, then everything is just additive on top, right?
Do you mean the use cases?
Right.
Yeah, so these are, for the record, we've been doing interviews with customer dev teams, and these are drawn out of interviews with customer dev teams. So I believe these, I don't know the attendance of these calls, so I'm not going to say specific customer names, but these can all be tracked back to specific interviews with customers. And it sounds like from their end, these were maybe sort of like dream world best case things that they could do. But from our end, they honestly sound pretty tackleable. So we're trying to get the scenario to work end to end.
And
right.
Sajid, your question was specifically like, so we have some amount of support for nested verifiers right now. Is your question like, does our current implementation hold water, or?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Should we revisit the entire executor model and just regut the whole thing over, right? And just
we've been looking at the code a fair bit. I think some aspects of it are really solid. I think some aspects of it could use a little finesse. Like one of the areas that sort of has been concerning us is how closely coupled the verifiers in the store are, where you have to pass a store to the verifier so that the verifier can reach out and get the blob content.
Right.
This is even less polished, unfortunately. But I've been trying to sort of work out the logic flow in my head, and I zoom in down here. One of my ideas for the logic flow there is, if any verifier is going to verify this artifact type, the executor can go ask the store for the blob content, because that's probably going to be acted on by the verifier. And then you can just pass the verifier, hey, here's this blob content. You only need to worry about the actual content. You don't need to think about how it's referred to by other things, or how it relates to other things. You just need to look at this content and tell me, you know, is this signed by the right people, or is this a valid Sbomb?
Right. So you just want the actual data. You don't really care about the wrappers or the links to that data, right? In some way, that verifier can then just work with the signature blob or with the Sbomb itself.
And then in our view of it, all that information basically bubbles back up to Gatekeeper, to your constraint template. And there you can have a conversation about policy, right? Because Gatekeeper is the part of the workflow, or an OPA framework if you're in like a local flow.
Right.
That's the part of the framework that really does policy well. So that's the part that can say, I can confirm that there is an Sbomb and that it has an attached signature.
Okay. Now, I think that's good, because most of the time it's like we draw these things in the air and hopefully they all stick together, and getting some validation that we understood the problem first off when we did the linking of the verifiers and the blob, and that's why the store and the verifiers are stitched together. And the challenge is if you have a multi-blob scenario. So let's say, for example, in most cases that you're talking about is you're talking about one blob, right? You have a signature, you have a payload. But the moment you say, I want an Sbomb and some data related with this Sbomb, or if you have multiple blobs in it, like a Helm chart with a values file or anything else, then you get into a little bit more complex scenario of how do I pass all the data along? So that's why we didn't tackle that problem yet. But we could have an API that optimizes. I can send you the entire stuff bundled up into directly into the verifier, and the verifier can crack it open in any other API. So the contract can change. There's nothing stopping us from changing it. So
yeah, because I think to those two cases you put forward for a Helm chart where you've got multiple files that you need to grab, in that case you would just want to grab all the content, right? So I think that can be, that get blob content can be worked in that direction where it's just going to get the whole blob. And in the idea of an Sbomb with like a signature attached, you treat each of those references as their own thing, right? You'd evaluate the Sbomb as an Sbomb, you'd evaluate the signature as the signature. And then when that information bubbles back up to Gatekeeper that says, hey, we found for this image these linked references, and I think Yomi's waiting to be let into the Ratify meeting. Fortunately. But yeah, the idea in sort of our thought about it is that the actual idea of there's an Sbomb that has been signed isn't something that would be evaluated until you reached Gatekeeper, because Gatekeeper is the one that can say, oh, I can see that there's an artifact of type Sbomb and it has a nested artifact of a signature. But the Sbomb verifier doesn't know what to do about signatures. So the Sbomb verifier doesn't need to know that there's a nested artifact that's a signature, because it wouldn't know what to do with that.
Right. And that envelope and what key to use and all that is actually much more, it's an entirely different domain of how you would validate a signature versus how you would look at the Sbomb, right?
Yeah, they're totally different problems. The verifiers should just
and that's why we wanted to kind of bundle them individually but be able to compose them. So the last part that you touched upon was actually really useful, which is the vulnerability scan. We've been talking about standardizing vulnerability scan reports. There's no standard right now. I think SNCC is one option, but the problem is you cannot write something standard to get that. But I think what in the end we wanted to do was, the canonical example we've been using is, can we block any image that has log4j version foo, right? That's what we want to get to, where if you have a scan and you have log4j as a vulnerability, don't run this image, or at least warn or give me a.
Or more generally, if you have any critical vulnerability. Yeah, and I've been also wondering about the fact that there's no common vulnerability scan format. Like, I think at this point you'd be writing a verifier per format, basically, right? You'd have your SNCC scan verifier.
Correct.
Other
and
things
that's why cosign and Notary are separate verifiers, because they verify signatures that are in different format, and you can go down any path you want. So I think the object model above holds water, but the finesse of the implementation of how they communicate is something we have to evolve over time. And I don't have any concerns in all the stuff that's kind of like proposed here, and we can definitely evolve, work on each one of them if you have any priorities in mind.
Yeah, I will get back to you with regards to priorities. What I was thinking as the next step is I can open some issues in the repo with regards to these, and we can use that to help prioritize both from your end and from our end. I know from our end, probably the place to start is honestly splitting up the repositories, because I think that makes any further development a lot smoother.
Yeah, we can work on.
But that's a big move, so I understand that that's a pretty big ask.
No, I just did that for us, so.
Okay, maybe that's not too bad then.
Yeah, we can go through it. I'm sorry, I need to drop for another call, but I think Jimmy was talking about CoOp Clarity using Gripe on the side as well. So if folks know what that is, then please. to chime in.
Only a tiny bit. I'm going to stop
So-
sharing my screen and I'll give the host back to Eric or Susan.
Susan, sure. Susan is good.
So I just threw that out there that CoOp Clarity is using Gripe because there was mentions a sneak and all of that. Now CoOp Clarity has to like download the images and then gripe them, basically scan them, or it can scan SBOMs. I think if SIFT created the SBOMs, or if it's like a Cyclone DX format for the SBOM, then I think gripe will go after that as well. And I think SIFT's actually been added to Docker now. I think if you do like a Docker SBOM, you can it's using SIFT under the covers. But in any event, I just wanted to throw it out there, just another one besides Sneak.
Yeah, there's a hand. I've been looking I looked at that a little bit when I did the license checker thing, and I was like, oh yeah, there's like a lot of flavors of this, but there's like, it doesn't seem like people have settled on like, oh yeah, this is the one flavor to rule them all. So
yeah, I think it's more of a like settling on an SBOM format. Like I think Cyclone DX is starting to really gain some momentum, but
I've actually got the opposite perspective with regards to SBOM formats, where SPDX has seemed like the much broader accepted one so far. But Cyclone DX is definitely the next one on the list as far as we've seen. That's really the two main ones.
When you say SPDX, because I looked at SPDX and it's as far as I understand, so SPDX is a spec, and then there are many ways that you can store.
Yeah, you can have it in RDF, XML, tag value, JSON. Most of what we've been doing so far has been working with the assumption of JSON SPDX, because that seems to be fairly popular and also just generally makes it nicely machine readable.
Well,
but there's definitely
think
tooling that converts between the versions.
So I also think that JSON would be a good decision because your policy as code tools are going to easily be able to parse that and give you intelligent decisions about what they see in the SBOM if you were ever going to actually scan and write a policy against a particular SBOM.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I use tag value because I think that's the default for whatever. When I wrote license checker, that was the default for whatever tool I used for that. But yeah, I think when I was looking at it, a lot of the tools that I saw for generating SBOMs they'll let you pick. They'll be like, oh, you can output Cyclone DX, you can output tag value JSON. So I think it'd just be a matter of in the context of Ratify, you can have whatever verifier. Maybe you have a verifier that can consume that and bubble it to like a common, like the JSON, and then you can pass that back up. But for the overall change, yeah, that was my only concern with the verifier change that you had was just that the verifier is then constrained to just the one blob you provide it, which is less. For me, it's like, okay, that's less extensible, but I don't necessarily have a good reason why that's a problem right now. Like we don't have a verifier that we have or that I could think of that's like, oh yeah, that verifier needs to go decide and pick and choose all the stuff that it needs, and that's why it needs the refer store. So
we've been thinking that the use case for any decision point that involves more than one artifact, basically, which is what that problem, like that problem would be if you need to make a decision that involves two or more artifacts, right? And they're like different types. We've been thinking all of that sort of bubbles up into Gatekeeper and gets handled there. But definitely we could do some more exploring there and sort of figure out what use cases look like in that sort of corner of the problem space. Like I think that Gatekeeper or OPA policy in general should be probably the best place to handle that, because you can set up those complex decisions there in a way that the verifiers would have to get pretty hacky to support well.
Yeah,
I
I think even our
there's a domain, there's sort of a domain agnosticism here that we could really leverage if we did not try to tightly couple this all these decisions into verifier, I guess, with policies that are in that layer.
yeah, that makes sense.
So I had a question about the quick start piece. Do we have a little time to talk about that, or should I just open up a discussion? I can do that as well.
I mean, we got time here.
Okay. So I went through, I'm building a test environment and I'm trying to run an ORIS registry. I've got it up and running in my EKS cluster and everything seems to be working fine there. I installed Ratify using the quick start instructions and everything seemed to install. A couple weird things I saw were when I wanted to change the namespace from default to like Ratify namespace using, Helm values. And while it installed Ratify in the namespace Ratify, it did not update the provider configuration. So I had to go back into the provider configuration and set that correctly. So I think there's an issue there. But when I look at the logs for Ratify, they're coming up and I see a verifier was created and policy was created, listing on 6001. Everything seems to come up fine. But when I run the demo of like a signed versus unsigned image, both of the pods get created and I don't see any logs in Ratify. So I know I've done something wrong or stupid here, but I'm trying to figure out, if there's a different, better documented approach to setting this all up instead of the quick start. Maybe the quick start's a little outdated. I don't know.
So the only change that you made was the namespace that the actual Ratify pod gets deployed to.
Yeah, so I did that with changing the Helm, right? I just basically passed in a namespace and said create the namespace, and so Ratify comes up in that right namespace, and then I immediately got a failure because the external data provider was not configured properly, so Gatekeeper could not, execute properly, so couldn't find Ratify, so it failed. So I went in and found the provider config, and I changed the URL there to include the right namespace instead of default. It was a Ratify. That worked in so much as now I could see that Gatekeeper was not failing. However, Ratify was not stopping the unsigned image from creating a pod. So there's something else I'm doing wrong here, I'm sure, but that's those two changes are it. That's all the only changes I made.
Okay, so so in the provider, you changed the name of the provider. That was it.
Just the namespace.
The namespace portion of the URL, right? So
the provider has a
I see.
URL in it, and I think I fixed this with a PR that I put in last week. So depending on when you did this, you might have done it.
I did it today.
PR. Oh.
I did it. I just did it today. Yeah. Helm did fine. Helm went out there and created Ratify in the right namespace. However, the provider configuration never picked up the right namespace. It stayed at default. So I had to go back in and edit the provider. And then once it did, then everything was fine.
So in our quick start, we say Helm repo add Ratify. And updating that chart, does that require that's published by a GitHub action, right?
Yeah, I think once when we kick off a release, that's when the new chart gets published. So I think these changes might not actually be reflected in the chart.
Yeah.
So it's not there yet, you think, or it is?
It might not be in the upstream repo. It might also be that you need to run a Helm repo update.
Yeah, I did that too. I mean,
okay.
As a matter of fact, in the quick start, I think that piece is missing. But I always add a Helm repo update because I want to make sure I'm getting the latest one, or when I want to get the latest one.
Yeah, smart.
So yeah, that didn't help me much. So maybe it is not, maybe that fix is not in there. So, but I mean,
Yeah.
so that would fix getting the
Half of your
provider
problem.
configuration correct, which I can muddle through. The other part is a little deeper, and in that the logs, I see show that the verifiers were created and policy was created, and it looks like it came up nice and clean. Certs loaded from the Ratify certs path. However, it's not stopping the unsigned image.
One thing, Jimmy, is if you change the namespace you deployed Ratify in, you might need to change the namespace you deploy the constraint into, Eric. I think.
Is the
Uh,
Isn't that deployed by Helm? It should all be controlled by the same thing.
when you
the
do the
I thought the
apply.
constraint was a okay. You're probably right. Let me look here.
So what because the constraint has the namespace in it.
Oh,
Yeah.
So a little context. The chart exists and it looks nice, but some bits of it are a little kludgy. So the Helm chart for Ratify includes a constraint template, and then we tell you to go install a constraint that lives somewhere else, because Helm doesn't have a good way to order the objects that it creates, and we need that constraint template to be there before the constraint goes in. And the constraint that we tell you to go install by default is for a particular namespace. So if you actually go look at that code, unless you're deploying a pod to the demo namespace, that constraint won't cover your deployment or your kapply. So the options there would be to take this constraint, and you can modify it to, you could put namespace star or namespace default. And then
I don't want to
update.
brick my cluster. I probably just switch it back.
Yeah. So it should fail. I think our quick start will fail open by default. So it will. I think you should still be able to modify this stuff. But
Yeah,
that's
earlier when I put it in the wrong name, so I put it in the Ratify namespace, but didn't change the provider. It failed. I got an immediate failure saying that it was a gatekeeper failure.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if it's fail. I'm not sure if it's failing ignore. I think it's failing fail. So
fail closed. Okay.
Fail closed,
So the change that Lee had might not be in a release chart yet. So the quick start will have issues there if you install Ratify elsewhere, and then the constraint template would have to get updated, assuming you're deploying the pod that you're testing with, or you just ran through the quick start and ran these exact commands, and that was
So let me look real quick. If I look in the Ratify chart, which one is it then? Let me look in the charts real quick. So it'd be the Ratify gatekeeper chart, right?
Yeah. So if you look in there, and then in templates, there's just constraint. So this is what we tell you to put in the quick start.
But so the demo is still in the namespace.
Right. So that's to say if you
that's still where I'm running that's where I'm installing the pods. Gotcha.
Yes. So if you're just running down the quick start and doing this K run image and demo, then that should still be covered by the constraint that we provide. So there's maybe there might be more oddities with the namespace. I'll have to try that. If you have I'll see if I can reproduce that. That sounds interesting, but it sounds like we'll have to look at like cluster traffic and see if gatekeeper is trying to do something like call out to external data. Since it's not easy to instrument that, because that call comes from like in the Rego execution. So that's like I think the only nice way to do that right now is just to monitor like network traffic in the cluster and see if you're getting like requests going out. But Yeah, that's good to know. So if
I'll
you
try it out
deploy-
again. And it's probably, again, it's probably something stupid that I'm doing. So I'll try it out. Let you know.
Okay.
Okay.
Jimmy,
Yeah.
you did say you didn't see any logs from Ratify.
Well, I see logs from Wow. I see logs from Ratify now. I
So
think
when
I figured
the-
out. I think I figured out what I did.
Okay.
When the first Ratify thing didn't work because the provider didn't work, I deleted Ratify and then I reinstalled it, with Helm. But I think I also deleted the CRD for the
Constraint.
constraint.
Yeah.
So, because now I just reloaded that and I got a bunch of logs in there. So
Yay. Cool.
I'll try it again and take a look at it. But going forward, if I wanted to switch the source registry and images and certs, is that well documented?
I think to some degree.
Okay.
So there's some amount of that you can do through the chart. And then there's definitely still paper cuts there. Though.
Okay.
So like the tests, I think we were talking about this actually earlier today, is there's some stuff in there for mounting certs from Azure Key Vault. And then there's one variable that you can set a certificate as like just the certificate text in the values, but there isn't a good way to add more than one just catted certs into the values.yaml. And we don't have
that. I remember that like a few weeks ago, we were talking about that. That's fine.
And
as long as I get some testing, I would just like to get one cert working outside of, Azure and into the local, like I'm running an Oris distribution registry inside my ECAS cluster. So
yeah, if you just take a cert, like a PEM that you have, and replace what's in the values.yaml as Ratify test cert, you should be able to use whatever cert.
All right, that was it. I fixed it. That was the constraint YAML I deleted it with Ratify. So
Woo.
goodness
Yay.
gracious. Yeah, so it worked. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, we do still need to address that whole telling people to install this random one other file. But having that work nicely within Helm is another ball of work.
Yeah.
Gatekeeper does it, but they do it using, they have a container that they run as a Helm pre-step and post-step that installs a bunch of other stuff. Yeah.
They have to, because Gatekeeper is, if you don't, there's a race condition. You have to have that template in there before that constraint goes in there, and there's a certain amount of time you need for it to register. And so
yeah, so we could draft off of their implementation of that, but it's just.
Do you want the constraint installed by default, or do you want people to stop and think about what constraint they're putting in place and sort of walk them through, like, here's your constraint if you're doing pods in this namespace? So I feel like that's a little bit safer, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, Lee, you're right there. I think the quick start, it makes sense that it's automated and you can install the constraint and then point out that you installed the constraint and here's what it looks like. But otherwise, when you're going to implement this in production, you're going to install those templates, and then you're going to come behind that later and start to decide which constraints will go in there, pointing to which namespaces and other selectors that you want for this type of solution.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the things that I was also talking about today, is that we wanted the quick start to have a get you going, so you can play, it's common for people to want to play with stuff in 5 steps. But yeah, we definitely also need documentation. Since I'm of the opinion that we either need to provide a large, a good number of templates that let people just be able to play with constraints without having to really know what else is going on, or either or in addition to documentation that kind of shepherds people through the constraint template stuff with respect to Ratify, since the it would help people to kind of understand, like, here's the shape of the data that comes back from Ratify. Here's how you can, write your Rego to play with that data. Because that's sort of my opinion, is like, once Ratify is in there, the constraint template is like a cluster operator thing. And we should empower people enough to not be confused about the Ratify specifics of that. But it's sort of my take that, like, from there on out, like that's an operator thing.
Yeah, agreed.
And our internally they didn't like that answer, but that's sort of what I feel.
So the looks like audit's enabled by default, right? Unless you tell it not to, for the gatekeeper constraint.
We pretty
Okay.
much ship a mostly default. Like, we change a very few things, I think, for gatekeeper, and there to, like, really make the external data provider thing work better or at all. And everything else is just vanilla gatekeeper. So if that was also the assumption, the quick start gets you gatekeeper because you obviously need it for this all to work. But, like, for an advanced user, the assumption would be that they might already have gatekeeper, and maybe we should have docs that tell you, here's how to glue Ratify onto your gatekeeper that you have. Since, like, the only thing they really need, if you've already got gatekeeper with external data provider enabled, is the provider template. So.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, thank you for indulging my stupidity and getting this working. So
Glad it's working. That's always good. If it's not working, then maybe we need to fix something.
So when do you think you said there might be a new updated chart out soon?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, so we don't update our chart until we do a release. So at the moment we're at 1.3.
0.3 or something.
Yeah, something like that. So we can also do something like update the chart as soon as there's any update. So we're trading off, like, stability versus.
No worries on my end, at least, because now that I know what I'm up against, I will just go in and make the change, and that'll fix it. So
You can also always just clone down the repo
Repository.
chart.
Yeah.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Like, that's what I've been doing in the meantime. So
we started with that, and then there was a push for us to have, like, a Helm repo add.
yeah, I mean, a published chart is definitely way nicer than cloning the repo, but if you need a workaround.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as, like, a release goes, I don't know if we have, like, a defined release cadence. So in theory, we could just go make a patch release. Like, I don't know if anyone's gonna be upset or like it's there's a bunch of forks of the repo and there's a bunch of stars, but, like, other than the people on this call, we're blissfully unaware of who's playing with this. So it's like, yeah, if we have something that would be nice to unblock people and we've already got, I'm sort of in the let's just make a patch release boat.
Yeah, sounds good. So we'll go with 1.4 alpha. Yeah, I can release one tomorrow.
It's 014, right? Or
yes.
is it okay?
It's like 3 digits, like
okay.
Yeah. 0.1.4 alpha.
Cool.
0.1.
Dot experimental.
Yeah.
Final. Perfect.
All right. We're at time today. Good to see everyone. Lee, are you happy to share your proposal, or at least part of it?
Yeah, I figured the next steps are putting that into GitHub issues. That seems like the best format for discussion of it. I can absolutely just send you over the doc as well, but I figured GitHub issues would be an easier method for sharing. But either way, whatever's easiest for y'all. As long as you understand that it's not totally finalized, happy to share it.
Yeah, if you put a link in the HackMD, you can just put it in the notes.
I don't know if it's shareable outside of Microsoft, so I can like send it to y'all, but I don't want to put it in the meeting notes if it's not accessible even outside of Microsoft. And I believe
Understood.
right now it is.
Akash has been putting some notes under your own account, right, Akash? Just in
Yeah.
a markdown format.
Yeah, actually, we should also, maybe we can pick this up next time, but we might want to discuss a centralized like HackMD repo where we dump all of our design docs and stuff.
Yeah, we're starting to accrue a lot of HackMD links, so it'll be good. It'll be good to figure out where stuff should live, for sure.
For now, I'll put it into GitHub issues since I think that's the best way to share it, and I can retroactively like link a bunch of those in the HackMD notes. Does that sound good?
That'll be great. Yeah.
All right, sounds like a plan.
Cool.
It was good talking to y'all.
Awesome.
Yep.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
See you next week.